Hello, everyone. It's December, so it's time to give some stuff away. Throughout the year, I've had publishers and authors sending me some of their books and saying, hey, would you mind giving this away to your listeners? And of course, I said yes, because they're great books that would be of huge interest to you. They include A Voice for Animals, Segregated Species, World War Zoos, The Creative Lives of Animals, Creatures' Needs, and The Omnivore's Deception. If you're interested in being entered into a draw to get your hands on one of these books, all you have to do is share your favorite episode of The Animal Tone via social media. Make sure that you tag us so that I am aware of it and you get entered into the draw. And Bob's your uncle. Next year, I will announce who the winners are.
This is another iROAR podcast.
On pig farms, ventilation was shut down in factory farms and animals literally cooked alive in their own body heat. That's a fact. It's a biophysical fact. You don't have to dress that up, but that's also the story. Ventilation shut down and animal suffering is the story there. And again, and that's a story that resonates, like the sheer volume of coverage of ventilation shutdown, by people like Matt Johnson getting undercover footage in Iowa and whatnot. Those are stories people care about. I think if people feel like they're not being clubbed over the head with something that is being snuck in, but if the story is mass scale animal suffering, readers care about that. The public cares about that.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Season 8 of the Animal Tone podcast, where we're focused on animals and media. In today, the 9th episode of the season, we're focusing on, yet again, another form of media. Today, we're going to be speaking all about news. If you've been following the season so far, you know that the first half of the season, we focused on specific concepts related to animals and media. And since episode 5, we've switched to talking about particular forms of media and the ways in which they're entangled with animals. And I'm looking forward to pulling and unraveling some of these threads between the episodes in the grad review coming up next. But for now, in today's episode, we focus on news and the variety of ways in which animals are represented and framed in the news, as well as how challenging it can be to even get animal stories into the news in the first place. We talk about everything from gatekeeping in media to how different forms of media, so legacy media versus new forms of news media, are interacting with and competing with one another, as well as how, attempts to get animals in the news happen. We spent a great deal of time talking and focusing on that. It's a really fascinating and interesting conversation that challenged me in a number of different ways, not only in terms of thinking about animals in media, but even the ways in which questions are framed and how I ask questions about the inclusion of animals in these kinds of stories. 3 guests join me on the show today with a variety of expertise and interest in animals and news. Shatabdi Chakrabarti is a freelance media professional based in India. She focuses on stories of wildlife, conservation, and communities, and she has been a contributing photojournalist at We Animals for over 3 years, documenting stories covering topics such as wet markets, shrimp farming, and intensive hen and chicken farming. If you're interested in more detail about what animal photojournalism is, make sure to also check out the episode with Joanne MacArthur, where we dive really into depth about that form of journalism. Shatabdi also provides mentorship as part of her capacity building work. And as a filmmaker, photographer, and writer, her work has been published and exhibited in both national and international platforms. She's a member of Her Wild Vision initiative and has produced films, photo essays, and articles for Vice, WWF India, Round Glass Sustain, and Nature in Focus, among others. Jessica Scott-Reid is a freelance journalist. She's been covering animal topics in major Canadian media outlets for the last decade. This includes the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Vancouver Province, Winnipeg Free Press, and many, many more. Jessica is also the culture and disinformation correspondent for Sentient Media. And finally, Jan Dutkiewicz is an assistant professor of political science in the Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies at the Pratt Institute. His research examines the design, production, circulation, and consumption of everyday commodities, with a primary focus on meat and other food products. His book, Feed the People, co-authored with Gabrielle Rosenberg, was recently published, and it envisions a more just and sustainable food system. He's working on a second monograph that focuses on the politics of American corporate meat production. His research on these topics has been included both in academic journals and mainstream media. In terms of journals, this includes Nature Food, Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems, the Journal of Cultural Economy and Food Ethics, and in mainstream media, Wired, The Guardian, The New Republic, The Washington Post, Vox, and The Wall Street Journal. Needless to say, these three people know what it means to produce news stories about animals and some of the challenges that come with that space, but also some of the opportunities and the gaps that emerge. So it's a really great conversation. I found myself being challenged and leaning in more ways than one. So I hope you feel the same way. Before I let you go, just a quick thank you once again to our sponsors. Thank you to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E, for sponsoring this podcast, and to the Pollination Project, the School of Modern Language, the Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts, as well as the School of Literature, Media and Communication at Georgia Tech University for co-sponsoring the season as part of a research project there. Okay, I think that's enough for now. The season is almost done. 2025 is coming to a close. I hope you enjoy this and that it gives you something to chew on as you enter the end of the year. Hi, Shatabdi, Jessica, and Ian. Welcome to the Animal Tone podcast. It's great to have you on the show today. So as always, perhaps let's start with learning a little bit about you. So the three of you are all journalists, but you're journalists in different realms and different ways. So maybe you could tell me just a little bit about you, the type of journalism you do, and how you got interested in kind of making these connections between animals and reporting.
I'm Jessica Scott-Reid. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm based in central Canada. I've been covering animal and environmental and food issues for major media here in Canada for about the last decade as a freelancer. A lot in the opinion section, because I think that allows me to center the animal more in the types of stories that I want to write. Currently, I'm also the culture and disinformation correspondent for Sentient. I've been freelancing for them for many years as well, but I've moved into this new role where I get to take on sort of pervasive myths about the food system, animals and climate, and debunk some of these myths for our readers and now also our viewers, because I do videos as well. So I've been working in the space of animals and the environment for this very long time. And both personally and professionally, it's been an important topic for me as an animal lover and an environmentalist. Growing up in the Free Willy era, I always say, in the 80s and 90s, where learning about animal sentience started at a young age, and it's thankfully evolved into a career. So it's been very fulfilling to be this person, both personally and professionally.
Was it part of your career in early days? Like, was this always a part of your vision when you thought, okay, I'd become a journalist in animals, or thinking about the climate would be part of my / your mission? Was that always the goal, or like, how did you find yourself on the journalism track of things?
I never really thought that it could be my full-time job. I started always working in media. I have a communications background, and then I did a master's in cultural studies. I was living overseas, writing about culture and food. And just as I personally evolved into the vegan that I am today, I made a decision at one point that I really wanted to focus on writing about animals, but I didn't actually believe that it could be a full job. So it's actually been a dream come true to be able to harness my passion in this way and create a full career out of it.
Amazing. And Jessica, you've recently started doing video, but Shatabdi, you've got a long kind of experience with visual media. And I'm hoping later on we'll get to speak a bit about this connection between visual media and the news. But how about you? How did you start to bring animals into focus, as it were?
So I began, my career began in a news agency, but I was a producer of a show. I was one of the producers for this political satire show. So in that sense, my career started with some, sense of journalism, because it used to be in one of India's top news channels at that point of time, and we were doing political satire. So that's the journalistic, aspect to the career today. But this whole thing about animals, so I grew up in spaces in the country where nature was all around me. So it was never, thanks to my dad's job at that point of time, he would get transferred every 5-6 years. And we would get to stay in locations where, I could still walk and go to a waterfall, like, close to my house, or walk to a hiking trail very close to my house. Or, the house was surrounded by some orchard. So I grew up with, lots of wild species around me. So the love for nature, I think, was very, like, it was always there. And when I started working as an adult, and, when life started going in the career and what to do, what not to do, I kind of very organically found myself gravitating towards stories which is about the environment, which is about the nature around us, communities, indigenous people. So now, if I look back, I think it just happened very organically. Maybe the childhood had an impact, and then the early career in a news agency kind of all, it just mixed together in a way that these are the kind of stories that I want to tell, whether it's as a filmmaker, as a photojournalist, as a writer, but it has to be a mix of both.
And when did the connection with We Animals? I know that you're a correspondent with We Animals. When did, and they obviously do amazing work in terms of bringing visuals to a whole host of different spaces. But when did that kind of start for you? When did you make that connection with them?
I think just after COVID, because I had visited a location where, so I, like, my photography started a lot with, going to the forests and documenting, or photographing wild tigers and wild animals and all that. That was the fascination. But then very slowly, because I would travel into the interiors of the country, I started realizing and I started seeing what's happening on ground. So it also became about these unseen stories and unheard stories from the hinterlands, where there is a constant overlap between, humans and animals, whether it's for survival, whether it's for land, whether it's for use of that land or resources. So, when I used to visit these, coastal villages where there would be fishing communities, and I would see what's happening there. And one thing kept striking me a lot, that, in the news section, related to conservation issues, I would see a lot of visuals from Southeast Asia, but not a lot from India. There is a huge market in India, whether it's fishing, whether it's meat, whether it's animals which are being farmed, but the visuals are very less, or the name of the country doesn't come up in those conversations about, shark fin trade happening in Southeast Asia. But India is also a part of that. We are exporters in meat, leather, and all these things. So I reached out to We Animals saying that, okay, this is my, this is what I do. Yes, it is more about conservation, but I also feel that these issues are a part of conservation, because now everything is overlapping. I can't see wildlife and conservation separate from farmed animals, or, fishing communities, or a community which is dependent on something like this for their livelihoods. It is all overlapping right now. There are livelihood issues, there is population issues, health issues, all of it is together. So I reached out to them and I did a couple of assignments, and then we've been working together since then. And it has also opened my eyes to a lot more different layers of the situation, because it also shows how what is happening in India is also being, it's also having an effect across the globe, because we are the exporters. So,
no, I read Yamini Narayanan's wonderful book, Mother Cow, Mother India, and it just does an incredible job of highlighting this kind of connection between the politics of, cows in particular in India, but the politics of animal relations in country are amazing. And I think it's one of the reasons why there is also incredible scholarship coming out of India, with people making these amazing, political and often quite very insightful ideas about how animals and humans relate with one another. And speaking about conflicts, I think in a pretty authentic way. We sometimes, I think it's, especially when animals make an appearance in news or media, it's done in this kind of like flowery or utopian way. And then, or they're completely invisible, but it's kind of trying to unpack the real complexity of the conflict is often missing. And there are people and animals increasingly at in boundary areas, rubbing up against one another in ways that are difficult for both the people and the animals involved. Now, Jan, I know you do a lot of work on politics and animals, and you think a lot across kind of thinking about politics, economics, and perhaps not even animals. I don't know if you would classify yourself as centering animals or centering primarily food in your journalism. And you're also a scholar. So how did you how did you come to, start to do these really quite like lengthy, in-depth reporting on what you see going on in the world?
Yeah, as you said, I mean, I'm a professor of political science at the Pratt Institute. I'm a contributing writer at Vox. I'm a contributing editor at the New Republic. And yeah, I guess I came to doing the type of public-facing writing I did just quite simply because I didn't see it existing, and I had the unique opportunity to start doing it. So I have a background, a professional background in the media, in the print media, before I went into academia. And then in academia, I primarily studied the political economy of human-animal interaction, primarily via the food system, primarily in the United States. And then once I sort of got into postdocs, I was postdocing at Hopkins, then I was at Harvard for a lot of years. And that just, I sort of felt like a lot of the things that I was researching just weren't being written about for a public audience. They were barely being written about in academia, but they certainly weren't being written about for a public audience. And so that's what spurred me to, I mean, initially to start pitching with relatively limited success, actually. But I think once you get Jessica's laughing, but yeah, I mean, exactly, because I think there's a public interest. I think there's actually a quite wide disconnect. Maybe we'll talk about this later, and maybe I'm leaping ahead here, but I think there's a quite wide disconnect between public interest in these issues and what editors think is newsworthy. Right. And I think that's starting to come down. I mean, the existence of Sentient, the existence of Future Perfect at Vox, which covers these issues quite a bit. I think The Guardian's quite good sometimes on these issues. But I think that's how I did it. I just knocked on a whole lot of doors, sent a whole lot of emails, and just got myself a foothold to the point where now I think that issues related to the food systems, issues related to animals in ways that aren't cutesy, but also in ways that aren't sensationalized, in ways that are quite deep dives. And so yeah, do I consider myself an animal writer? I mean, it's a fraught question. I mean, I don't think so. I think, I mean, I'm a vegan. I'm a quite outspoken vegan, and I care deeply about animal rights issues, but I really consider myself a political scientist and a political economist, and that's how I approach my writing, and that's how I approach the issues that I choose to write about.
Yeah, I mean, all of your work is really fascinating, and I've enjoyed engaging with the material that the three of you have raised. And like you say, I think what we're seeing is an increased acknowledgement that this is newsworthy to an effect, right? It is deserving of news. And sometimes, I mean, I'm frustrated when I engage with people, scientists who are working on climate change and are not thinking about how climate is connected to food systems. It just seems like a completely obvious oversight. And I think you've done a lot of work to try and do, I suppose, some form of consciousness raising to say how disconnected these issues are. So what explains this disconnect between editors and public interest?
Look, I honestly think it comes down to speciesism, and I mean that quite literally, in the sense of not considering animals' interests as mattering, or not considering the animal issue as potentially politically or socially salient on the part of editors, right? But I mean, it was the same in academia, right? I mean, again, this has changed over the past decade and a half that I've been in academia, but early in my time, it was extremely difficult to publish articles or get accepted to conference or even have your work taken seriously if it involved taking animals seriously. And I think that's changed. And the reason I say that there's this disconnect is because if you look at any public opinion survey, at least in the United States, people broadly care about animal welfare, about animal issues. These are often polarizing issues, especially when they touch on things like diet and when they touch on things like agricultural, political economy. But nonetheless, there's a deep interest. And so once these stories are out, the stories tend to do well and generate debate and generate conversation. But it's just a matter of getting them out. And again, I think over the past decade or so, this has changed quite a bit, because I think who's making editorial decisions has changed. Editors of, be it editors who cover political issues in the United States. I'm thinking here of The Intercept or Wired, are very interested in covering things like government crackdowns on activists. Editors of places like The Guardian and who cover the environment are now very much cognizant of the environmental impacts of animal agriculture, or the impact, for instance, anthropogenic climate change on animals and agriculture. So I think the door is sort of starting to be wedged open. But I absolutely think that there is this, look, editors are gatekeepers, right? And so editors' subjectivity, background, and individual prejudices or proclivities absolutely impact what gets covered and what doesn't. But I absolutely think that in large-scale legacy media, and this can, if you read large-scale legacy media, you'll see this. A lot of people think of animals as food, and it's really hard to think of taking animals seriously, right? When you're at an institution that's running, reviews of steakhouses, and then you want to run something about the contribution of livestock to climate change or the politics thereof, and you're even looking at your stable of writers and who's going to write it. And I don't want to name names in this context, but you look at the New York Times or Bloomberg, you just don't have the capacity internally, right? Like if someone's trashing alt protein or writing beef recipe reviews or steakhouse reviews, and that's who you would point to write your animals and climate story, like it's quite simply not going to work, right? So it is for lack of a better word, it's a human capital issue, it's a staffing issue, and it's a capacity issue at large scale which is why I think smaller outfits like that either work with freelancers or that are focused on particular issues, like Sentient, for instance, can be, of course, far more agile because this is what they cover.
I wonder if this is also because of some of the, news has always struggled with this kind of tension between needing to bring in revenue and have kind of committed, accountable, objective reporting. And that can sometimes lead, we've seen it with stories with regards to humans as well, but certainly with regards to animals, how do you appease advertisers and as well as kind of report on stories that matter? And how do you do it within, the same publication? Broadsheets newspapers used to struggle with the same thing. How do you have a story that's critical of an industry and then an advert of that industry in the same publication? And they always try to kind of pry it apart that these were different parts and you can't really ever smooth it over, but their job was to report what was reporting. And I don't know if perhaps to some extent, kind of the digitalization of news and the fracturing of it has made this even more difficult. Jessica, does some of what Jan has said there kind of resonated with what with your experiences of breaking in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point that you made, Jan, about that once the story is out there, they are so popular, because I find so often I'm fighting to get particular topics into newspapers. And then once I do, they're extremely popular. And I knew they were going to be popular, but to convince an editor or an editorial team that this is something worthwhile is the tricky part. I think also I've experienced conflict within editorial teams where you have some sympathetic editors or some editors who see the value in these stories and those that don't, and that there has been struggles. I have been noted on that editors are somewhat, arguing with each other whether or not to allow these stories to make it out there. I have found better success in the opinion section, which some may argue is a little bit less legitimate. In some cases, it's not reported. But in Canadian media, for example, because I have been so opinionated in the opinion section, I'm not often allowed to report on these topics. That would be considered a conflict. So I'm allowed to run a little bit more rampant in the opinion section. And I think having these dissenting opinions is more permitted. In fact, it's welcomed in a lot of publications. And so I've utilized that strategy in order to make the points that I want to make and to bring to light things that I want to bring to light and to center animals in those stories in the ways that reports don't. Jan makes another good point, is that animals are often discussed as food. They're also discussed as property. And so when we have reported pieces that talk about, say, I always use the example of a barn fire. We have, a report of a bonfire that will talk about the devastated farmer and the loss of monetary value, a loss of product, And almost nobody will talk about the devastation that came upon the animals. And almost never will an animal advocate be consulted or interviewed. I find this is changing now that I've called it out a couple times in Canadian media. We see more now, even agricultural publications are actually talking to groups in Canada, say as animal justice, to talk to them from a legal standpoint even, and then you can talk about the plight of the animals. So I think it is changing, but I like to utilize these different strategies of creating relationships with certain editors of certain sections and hoping that they stay in that position for a long time and continue to let me say the things I want to say.
But I mean, you raise an important kind of aspect here is what is news, right? When we're talking about animals and media more broadly, there's a lot of avenues we could go through with regards to thinking about animals, right? Representations of animals in film has come up a lot in this season. The kind of, I guess, responsibility we have to animals with regards to how we share images of them or even take images of them. The kind of proliferation of selfies with wildlife is causing devastation for a lot of animals. But then it comes to what is news, right? An opinion is an interesting kind of, I want to almost say like a liminal space of news, because it's not just, there are some publications where opinion, you can just kind of say whatever you want, but there is more justified and less justified opinions, or more informed or less informed opinions. But then the question becomes, what is news? And I know we're getting a bit more broader here. But before I move on, Shatabdi, I don't know if you have anything to add to this kind of question of thinking through, I guess, editorial gatekeeping and public interest. You come from a different context, right, to North America. Do you find similar kind of things going on in the newsrooms there?
Yeah, especially with what you mentioned regarding, advertisers and what you're reporting. So, but again, like with digital news agencies coming up, a lot of independent news agencies coming up, which are public funded, which work on subscriptions. So this aspect of you have to be careful about what you report, because the advertiser, for that particular segment of news is a particular food, whatever company. So with the digitization, I think there is a lot more space to tell, these kind of stories where you don't have to be very careful about what you're saying and all of that. But I think the other side of it is that in India, from what I observe about the news and all, such topics I don't think are getting the reporters that they should be getting. Because it is also political right now, especially. So instead of talking about, the health impact on humans with regards to farmed animals, let's say, or the environmental impact, or the impact on, agricultural fields which have poultry farms around them. These are things that impact the people directly and the land and the environment, but they don't get reported as such. They're not news. I think it's almost like they're not newsworthy, because people are more interested in politics and all of that, and sports and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like there's this common refrain that we can't talk about animals until we've sorted out all human issues. Like somehow it's speaking about, which it's, Jan, you spoke about academia. I see this often happening even in academic circles, that it's somehow an affront to put animals front and center, and I think there's definitely more appetite for climate stories. And I don't know if you would agree with me here, but it seems like a lot of animal advocates and scholars and people are kind of getting their words in and their thoughts in about animals using a kind of climate route. And there seems to be a little bit of conflict there.
I was just going to mention that is a strategy we see at Sentient. We're really focusing much more now on the connection between animal farming, animal agriculture, climate change. And it's been, I think, a successful strategy, in my opinion, in order to bring in different audiences and to get more into the environmental journalism space, which, unfortunately, but is the case, considered more legitimate. And it's also allowed us to have conversations with, experts and certain people in certain spaces that we may not have before, when we were more focused on, say, animal rights. So I think it's a great way in, and it's an undebatable link. So you can't deny the connection. And it also goes with this One Health aspect that all things connected with human health, environmental health, and animal health are connected. So I think it's a smart move, and it's working.
I just wanted to add on to something that Jessica said earlier. So, like you were mentioning that when there is a, fire or whatever, the loss is kind of reported in terms of loss for the farmer or for the owner of that barn or whatever. Like similarly here, like a couple of years ago, there was a massive flood in Delhi where I am. And then even in other flood situations, we do get to see small clips of, pet animals being rescued. But I've not maybe there have been some reports, but I've not come across those kind of clips showing, let's say of a dairy farm which was flooded and how they rescued all the cows over there in the farm. Those things are not there in the algorithm, and even if there are these kind of stories about, the street dogs are being rescued and a shelter is being rescued and all, those are like those little happy, like they're kind of, the narrative is like, oh, this is a cute story of, human helping these animals and all. It doesn't go deeper into the issue of why they were like, why is there a dairy farm from where the cows need to be rescued during a flood. It doesn't go deeper. It becomes a cutesy story, a feel-good story of, rescue and, human animal friendship and all of that. Nothing beyond it.
Yeah, I think it's a common refrain. It's something that I find quite like frustrating when watching legacy media, or often the puff pieces at the end of what's been a really hard hitting kind of session with speaking about the news, what's currently going on, will be like a soft, but like soft news. A soft news piece will often feature animals, and it'll often be this kind of like, oh, this animal had a baby in a zoo, for example, right? And it's somehow a heartwarming, and for folks, I think, who have an interest in animals or animal rights, this can be a bit jarring. Like, how are you looking at this situation and not seeing kind of structural problems that are happening here with regards to, I think zoos and writing about zoos as problematic spaces is not really written about at all, because they're seen as a kind of safe place for conservation. But it is interesting what does make it into the news and what doesn't with regards to the reporting. So as you guys have said here, I do think news and diet and to some extent factory farms are entering mainstream media and reporting a lot more. Conservation, I think, has been in the news for a long time, especially with regards to thinking about which animals are going extinct or not extinct. There seems to be a sort of fascination. But what stories are not being reported on? If you look at the climate now, as animal journalism is kind of gaining more traction, what are the current gaps in what journalists are reporting on?
I can speak to the idea of zoos that I have covered before in the past. A story about conservation washing in the Globe and Mail here in Canada, our national newspaper. And I know I've told people many times my motto when I'm writing these stories and pitching these stories is to be clever, not crazy, because so often it's assumed that a writer of my sort will be, over the top and have these very animal rights militant ideas. And so I know when I'm writing particularly about zoos to focus on something like conservation and say, misinforming the public. That's where I'm going to focus instead of just, wanting to say what I want to say, which is, zoos are fundamentally flawed and these places are terrible and animals shouldn't be there. So you find your way in to reach a mainstream audience where they're at. And that also convinces the editors that this is a story worthwhile for a mainstream audience. You will get in your points about the fundamental flaws of keeping animals in captivity, but you have to sort of couch it in these broader topics that might make, somebody who would go to a zoo stop and think, oh, wait a minute, this maybe pertains to me.
Do you think that your kind of commitment to animals, your veganism, gets in the way of you being able to be a reporter? And I mean, I ask this because maybe it's a thing that people are questioning. I get questioned about this as a scholar, kind of undermined. How objective can you be? How much can you really look at the data if you have this kind of political commitment or acknowledgement that things are unequal? And it's interesting because I don't know if we would ask the same thing of scholars and journalists who are committed to, let's say, human justice
Right.
news stories. But yeah, let's leave it open. Do you think that your veganism or your commitment to animals gets in the way of your reporting?
I mean, I would invert the initial question, right? If work is being published in, be it in academia, in peer-reviewed journals, or in fact-checked news media, then the positionality of the scholar or their normative commitments should matter less. I mean, obviously they shape what the person's writing about. But if we're talking about peer review and we're talking about pass and fact check, that shouldn't matter. I mean, in fact, I think the question should be asked: why is someone who is committed to meat eating have sort of pride of place in reporting on animal issues or the links between animals and zoonotic disease or animals and climate change or whatever else, right? And why is that question not the question that's being asked, right? So in a sense, I feel like the question itself is misleading, right? Like it sets the wrong it sets the wrong sort of baseline for critique of authors, right? And so I think it shouldn't. I mean, yeah, because similarly, like, why would we say that, whatever, people who aren't committed feminists should have pride of place in reporting on issues related to women and reproductive health and the right to choose, right? Like, it sounds like an absurd question posed that way. So I would say that. And so I even think people who care about these issues engaging seriously with a question like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't have to defend your positionality, right? Because then you're automatically on the defensive on something you shouldn't be on the defensive of. The answer should be, did the thing I write pass a rigorous fact check? Yes? Okay. Next question. Or did the thing I write pass a rigorous academic peer review? Yes? Okay. Next question, right? Like, engaging in a defense of the ad hominem when you don't have to is already ceding ground, is already putting yourself on a defensive when you absolutely shouldn't be. Right. So I just think that the very fundamental conceit of the question undermines the nature of sort of as objective as possible journalism or academic research.
I think that's beautifully said and so powerfully said.
I was just going to add that I'm accused of this sort of thing, that because I often write in the opinion section or I write for places like Sentient that have a specific niche focus, that somehow I'm lying. And I will often say, when we ask what is news, to me nowadays it's hard to define because, things have gotten a little blurry. But to me, it's a team. And this team involves fact checkers and editors. And it's not just me in a vacuum in the opinion section or writing for different websites or publications that are just saying whatever I want. Everything goes through scrutiny. And it's my name is the byline, but behind the story is multiple people, multiple departments. And these things are really a collective piece of work. And I don't think that people on the outside of news media really understand that part, that it's not just someone on a soapbox, that this is rigorously fact-checked, evidence-based, cited with peer review studies. This is real. It's not just some vegan spouting off in the news.
I mean, I think what you two have said here is so important because, I mean, you spoke about gatekeeping happening, and I think gatekeeping can happen both from a person's kind of personal stance. You can have someone who's just against the idea of a story, or from how people ask or frame questions. That's definitely a way in which a form of gatekeeping happens. But I so appreciate what you guys are saying here with regards to undermining without looking at the facts or the details that are on the page, because there's this question of objectivity, right? And journalists have always geared themselves towards objectivity and sought to achieve it, while at the same time acknowledging that it's also kind of, it's an ideal. Like, how do any of us separate ourselves from our personal commitments and lives and the ways in which we understand things?
Like, sometimes there are topics which you cover where it becomes a little difficult to separate your personal thoughts about it, but I think at the end of the day, as a photojournalist or as someone who's documenting reality as it's happening, we have to kind of remind ourselves that, it is not about what I feel or what I am thinking about this. I am here to report what's happening right in front of me. Yes, I feel a certain way about it. That might change the way I'll frame a photograph, or I'll frame, I'll use light in a certain way to depict a certain emotion, but I cannot manipulate the truth to match what I'm feeling, because my job is to showcase reality as it is. So I think that is the thin line, we have to kind of always tread on, that we can feel whatever we feel, but when we are in the field, we are doing that particular job because people who will watch the visuals or who will read these words, they don't have access to this. They don't know about this. And me being there is the only gateway for them to know what is happening on ground. So I can feel what I feel, how passionately I feel separately, maybe in conversations with friends where I can be actually really biased about something. But if I'm documenting something which is newsworthy, which is reporting something, then I have to be true to that also.
Please join me for the Nature Disturbed podcast, a podcast about the good, the offensive, and the confusing parts of the animal kingdom, from the sewers of Florida searching for alligators. Oh no, did I forget to put the bins out? To the surface of Mars, investigating the possibility of life beyond Earth. Sorry, I had some bubbles lodged in my throat. I said, to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, all while interviewing scientists about their research along the way. Do you like comedy, whimsical storytelling, and learning about the natural world? If not, then you'll hate the Nature Disturbed podcast.
And I suppose that also means, I mean, like you say, it's not about only reporting the things you like or the sentiments you agree with. You might find, Jessica, I know you recently wrote a review of Liver King's documentary. And I so appreciated that you started that by saying you couldn't believe you found yourself nodding along with it, because there is a certain element of, with reporting, that sometimes you have to acknowledge the things. It's not about you personally agreeing or disagreeing with something. It's about reporting on what's currently happening or what's currently going on. Really, really important. Anyone else want to add to this? I feel like we're cutting to the heart of things. Jan, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, I was going to jump back to the previous question and also to what Jessica was saying. And again, sort of challenge the premise of the question gently, in a friendly way, challenge the premise of the question, which is, I feel like the question about finding ways to cover animal issues, for instance, sort of, you seem to suggest, and I could be wrong here, that we were talking, the implication was sort of like sneaking them in along with climate or along with zoonotic disease. But I just think that's absolutely, I think that's the wrong framing, right? Like, we know that food systems contribute a quarter to a third of anthropogenic emissions. And in fact, even acknowledging that in the academic, environmental, and NGO space has been a battle. The animal question has been, the third rail of climate academia and climate politics as well. And so I think so I wouldn't think of this as sort of like sneaking in the animal issue. I would see this as, putting it, I mean, I hate the, adding to the debate academic framing, but adding into the debate and making the links in academic research, making the links in public discourse between animals and climate, animals and zoonotic disease, or, animal agriculture and water use or whatever else. And I don't see that as making it a quote unquote animal issue. I just see it as acknowledging the role of whatever it is, right? Like land use change, concentrated animal feeding operations, growing crops for animal use, or whatever else, as being a major constituent part of whatever issue is being reported on. You're right. Be it zoonotic disease, be it climate. So I absolutely just think that it's not about like sneaking the animal question in. It's about acknowledging the magnitude of the animal question within whatever other issue is being talked about, right? And the reason I say that is because, before Livestock's Long Shadow came out, it was sort of anathema to speak about the role of ruminants and methane emissions in anthropogenic climate change. And then the authors of that within the FAO there's extensive journalism, which proves this is the case, were attacked. They were attacked by national delegations. They were attacked by lobbies. Again, ad hominem attacks were lobbed against them. These people were sidelined within the FAO. Academics, we saw a similar thing with Eat Lancet. And so even just stating basic facts is attacked by the very organizations, be it the intergovernmental organizations or the academic bodies that are themselves, ostensibly meant to defend and promulgate objective research, right? So, just saying something like ruminants contribute X% to anthropogenic climate change is not sneaking in the animal issue. It's stating a fact, and it's stating a fact that the very organizations that should be backing the stating of these facts have shied away from stating explicitly because of political and public blowback.
Yeah. I hear you. Talking about animal agriculture is fundamental to talking about these issues. If you're talking about zoonosis or the threat of disease and you're not speaking about animal agriculture, you're missing a fundamental / critical part of what this conversation is. It's almost poor reporting to some extent if it's not included in this kind of discussion.
Precisely. Or talking about methane without talking about ruminants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right? It's not an honest discussion if those things are omitted.
But I do think, I hear you, and 100% I'm with you here. When you watch these documentaries talking about climate change and there's zero mention of animal agriculture, like you think, okay, well, how much research went into doing this? Like it has to be an active decision at this point to not include animal agriculture in this kind of reporting. It seems to me like an active omission, not just ignorance. But when it comes to reporting and we can continue on both of these streams, I think there is, to some extent, the acknowledgement and the reporting of the size and the scale of animal agriculture, that this type of farming it contributes to these huge crises. But something that I don't think is reported, and this perhaps speaks to a little bit to what Jessica was mentioning earlier, is the experiences / deaths of these animals. This is happening at two levels. Yes, the farming and eating of these animals is contributing to global crises. And I think that is gaining some traction. And when I was talking about quote unquote sneaking in the animal, I think I was also saying, to what extent can we acknowledge that the animals experience being in these situations, right? Because people don't really take that on board as being really an important part of this conversation of climate change, etc.
I wanted to add to both of the points regarding how to report on animal issues and doing it in a way that centers the animal, that keeps our feelings out of it and just allows the experience to be reported on, is that I'll often tell people who take a workshop, if I'm writing for whether it's animal activists or freelancers, is to just let the facts speak for themselves. Even if you're writing in a reported piece, or if you're writing for specific outlets that require you to, focus on a particular beat, the facts in this case, when we're talking about the impacts of animal agriculture on the climate, we're talking about, animal welfare issues in factory farming, the facts are bad enough. The facts are stark enough, and the facts are backed up enough. So if we can just focus on the facts without any kind of emotive language, over the top expression, we don't need to. And I feel like so much of the expectation from mainstream audiences when reading on topics like this is for that to happen, is for things to be exaggerated and overblown. And that really works counter to what we're trying to express. And so I think it's best to let the facts speak for themselves, and we can, because they're bad enough.
Yeah, I think it's also important to kind of tell the story, like report the story or tell the story in such a way that whoever is reading it or watching it, it impacts them regarding themselves. Like if I talk about, aqua farms in, this river basin is harming the mangroves. Okay, people will read it and be like, okay, fine, like it's not impacting me, I don't care. But if I say that because of the aqua farms, the groundwater is impacted, the soil fertility is impacted, the local people in that area cannot use the groundwater because it's all polluted now, then when it becomes about their own safety, their own survival, their own health, then it becomes more important for them as well. If I sit here and talk to somebody and tell them that, okay, if you're eating the chicken, do you even know what is going behind the scenes, It'll instantly be, yeah, whatever, I like the butter chicken I eat. Because what has also happened is that people in the cities, especially cities and towns nowadays, you get your meat in nicely packaged boxes. You are not seeing the blood, the gore, the suffering. You're not going to the local butcher shop, seeing it being butchered live. It comes in these neat plastic boxes, in 10 minutes. You order it online and it's there in your house. So that creates like a disconnect between suffering and what's on your plate. So when you start talking to them about these kind of issues, because they don't connect with it, like in that sense, they will not listen to what you have to say. But if you say that, okay, do you know that because of the stress this hen has been in the poultry farm, these health issues can happen to you because you're consuming the meat. That may impact them thinking, okay, it's about my health now. So I think at times you also need to change the perspective to kind of make the reader or the audience think about their own selfish reasons. And through that, you bring in the animal context to it.
Jan, is that fair? Does that address some of your critiques? Or do you think we're still just sneaking in the animal?
Well, no. I mean, I don't think. No, I guess what I'm saying is I don't think you're ever really sneaking in the animal. I think if the animal issue is salient, then it should be covered, just like any other aspect of any given case should be covered. I mean, and then how that's framed, I think, is a contextual issue, right? Right. If one is covering whatever, like the ill health effects of the underregulation of slaughterhouses, then absolutely, then you should state that it can have ill health effects on consumers, right? Or whatever, right? If you talk about the contribution of ruminants to climate change, then that's just a fact that states that, we can't hit certain warming targets without addressing ruminant agriculture. And I think as long as you're not sort of being maudlin or overwriting, like Jessica said, then I think the quote unquote animal issue should just be treated as a part of the story. If we're talking about news, as a part of the story where it fits, as a part of the story. And if a part of that story is animal suffering, then that's the story, right? And those are stories that themselves resonate when that's the story. So for instance, early in COVID with ventilation shutdown on pig farms, ventilation was shut down in factory farms and animals literally cooked alive in their own body heat. That's a fact. It's a biophysical fact. You don't have to dress that up, but that's also the story. Ventilation shutdown and animal suffering is the story there. And again, that's a story that resonates, like the sheer volume of coverage of ventilation shutdown, by people like Matt Johnson getting undercover footage in Iowa and whatnot. Those are stories people care about. I think if people feel like they're not being clubbed over the head with something that is being snuck in, but if the story is mass scale animal suffering, readers care about that. The public cares about that.
I think too often the problem with mainstream media, which is such a loaded way to start a sentence, is that so often it's progressing the message of the industry. And so often it's only industry people who are interviewed. So if we go back to our barn fire story, as an example, you'll talk to, say, dairy farmers of Canada, in my case, if a dairy farm has burned down, instead of talking to animal advocates. Whereas we see other topics, say if it's regarding, child safety or human rights, you will have advocates who are always interviewed. And you won't have industry interviewed when it comes to, the plight of vulnerable beings and vulnerable communities. So I think the idea of animals being treated in the mainstream media, even as living beings and a vulnerable community that requires advocacy, is new and unfortunate. But that, like Jan is talking about, the fact that animals suffer is a fact, that is something that I think has yet to be fully digested by mainstream media editors and audiences. And once you have that fact in place, then your next steps towards finding sources to talk about that suffering, that happens afterwards. But that has to be recognized first.
And do you have any examples? I mean, I think giving that example a moment ago with the ventilation shutdown really helped to kind of cement some of what you're saying here. So perhaps we could maybe talk about some of these examples, news stories, because part of this episode, I mean, it's thinking about what is news, but also the significance of news. Do you have any stories like the ventilation story that it's clear this was news done well, and this is news that's had an impact that people are speaking about? Any other thoughts or examples there?
I think there are numerous ones, right? I mean, very many long-term, well-done undercover investigations that get coverage have been shown in literature done by ag school economists in the short term reduced demand for the meat, where it's shown in the UK, the large investigation of dairy cruelty had, everything, like even the very validity of like the red tractor, farming third-party certification seal was in question. There were debates in major British media about whether or not you could trust third-party farm, sort of whatever, like farm animal welfare verifiers. And so I think that numerous stories, I think where the story clearly shows something like animal cruelty, that can set off sort of have broad-based effects on everything from consumer behavior to public debate. So I think there are a number of I think there are more examples that we could point to, and I think very, very, very many undercover investigations done well that are picked up speak to this.
I saw one recently about pandas and just kind of this exchange of pandas, the kind of politics of panda exchange, right? Also an investigative report, and just looking, I mean, we all kind of know that China owns all pandas and they're taken to different zoos and they're used as political pawns. But this was an unbelievable, and I wish I could tell you who reported it. I'll put it in the show notes. But it was really incredibly well done, not only in terms of highlighting, I think, the broad brushstrokes that many of us know about pandas, but going into depth and detail with regards to how pandas are bred, the situations in which they live, the ways in which they're mobilized as political tools, and also the failures of conservation. Because I think so often, we've spoken here about animals, but there's also things adjacent to animals, right? Consumption is one of them. Conservation is another one of them, and maybe adjacent's not the right word, but conservation is so often framed as this unbelievably positive thing that you don't critique. Conservation is beyond critique. And in this piece about pandas, what I thought was quite interesting is they said, okay, well, the panda rehabilitation and breeding program was all done on the premise of releasing pandas back into the wild. No pandas have been released or set free. So what is actually going on here in this breeding program, and just probing that question. So they're stating the facts. That's part of news stories. But I also think the opening up of a question can do a lot of work with readers and viewers as well. Just getting to ponder about a question like that. Shatabdi, do you have thoughts on like how conservation is reported and framed?
Yeah, I think so, because my work is in this country, and a lot of my context will come from what I'm observing, what I'm seeing. India has a great, let's say, success in terms of getting the tiger back, getting the one-horned rhinoceros back. These were all dedicated programs for these species to get them back from the brink of extinction. But now we are at a state where I think we need to start addressing the rising population, the conflict, because we are the largest country with some of the largest megafauna living, where we are sharing space, where we are sharing resources. And now it is becoming a fight for survival for both. So we have to start looking at, when conservation stories are addressed regarding, let's say, conflict or developmental issues, developmental infrastructure, which is now cutting through a forest. One has to look at it like from a larger perspective where everything is taken into consideration, because conservation without the other aspects cannot be, dealt with, and the other aspects without keeping conservation a part of it cannot be done. You can't have, right now it's June, it's supposed to be peak summer, along with like some parts of the country having the monsoon rains, but we are having floods. We have had unseasonal rains in so many parts when it's supposed to be peak summer, hot and dry and humid. It has rained randomly. Farmers do not know when to, now plant, when to cut, when to harvest, when to do what, because the predictability of the weather has changed. And if you start connecting the dots, you will see it is because, 100 or 1,000 acres of forests were destroyed a few 100 kilometers away because some road had to be built. Or, so you cannot talk about conservation in separate terms. Right now, all of it is interlinked. One cannot be looked at separate from the other. So even with conservation, if we are talking about the success of, tiger population increasing or any other programs happening, we have to see the context. What is happening to those tigers? Do we have enough forest corridors for them to now start relocating to other forests? What are there roads cutting through those forest corridors? What is going to happen when they come straight, face to face in a human habituated land, because they are just they are following the natural instinct and trying to disperse. So these are the questions now that we need to start talking about. Yes, saving animals and saving wild species, that has happened, but now what?
Yeah. And that kind of complexity, I mean, news, I feel like maybe I'm being unfair, has become dumber somehow. Like the level of complexity in news, and maybe I'm not fair, and maybe I'm not reading the right things. It depends on the sources you have. But I sometimes feel/fear that the level of complexity in reporting is diminishing. And to have this kind of conversation, to talk about conservation and say, okay, what happens when the numbers do increase? We talk about let's improve animal numbers, and I think it's a marvelous goal, and their numbers are still, even our populations that are increasing are still a shadow of what they once were. But you've got increasingly having situations where animals are reaching kind of capacity and they have nowhere else to move because there's no land or habitats. I had a vet from Uganda on the show where there are mountain gorillas for the first time that are doing well. They're like, whoa, they're a success story. They've got nowhere else to move. They're surrounded by villages. So then this kind of complexity requires, I think, a different kind of political response and also a nuanced reporting, right?
Yeah, I think nuance is an important part. Nuance is something that I know editors are looking for more and more now than ever. Nuance takes, especially because, politically in North America, everything's become so black and white, so right and left, that nuance is increasingly becoming important and sought after. And when we're talking about animal stories in particular, I think that's another important way of bringing in a variety of audiences, is offering nuanced takes, admitting where things have been, say, oversimplified or overshot, and then looking into the facts of the matter. And I think increasingly with news, as you say, it's gotten dumber. I think it's because there's too many outlets, there's too many things that are considered news that would not have been considered news before. And so this is when fact-checking and editorial teams become more important. Even legal teams become more important than ever before. And I think that gray area of nuance, where we have a little bit of discussion and analysis, is key in these types of topics.
Yeah, I know you've written about media literacy before, and you wrote a really great piece, I think, talking about podcasts, because I think there is this blurring of news, even raising the question of what is news. It used to be so kind of clear. It was almost based on the outlet of what news was. But now, the same way as, and I'm sure you can relate to this, my husband's also a photographer, the same way as now everyone who's got a cell phone is somehow a photographer, and everyone who can write a blog entry is somehow a journalist. And anyone can become these things. I think there has been a democratization that technology has allowed for, but it's sometimes... I don't know how to frame this. Is there a crisis of authority, I suppose, to some extent? Do people know which voices to trust and not to trust?
Yeah. Yeah, it's I'll just add a little bit to what you were saying. Like you said, everyone with a camera, today can, with a phone, you are out there in the world, with whatever is there in your capacity. But the problem is that because of this digitization, because of this access to technology and the digital medium, a lot of misinformation and a lot of disinformation is just going out as news or opinion of so-called subject matter experts, especially in these kind of spaces. So if you're a photographer and you're documenting, let's say, the wildlife in nature parks, and you do these, videos and put yourself out there, you're not a subject matter expert. You're not a scientist. You're not a tiger behavior, someone who has studied tiger behavior for 30 years, that you can start giving your opinion on why this tiger did this. But because of the fame and because of the visibility, people take these kind of, opinions very seriously and think it's fact when it's not. Anything to do with wildlife or science or climate change or environment, it is science-based. So if you're a practitioner of some other sort of art form or whatever, you are not the subject matter expert. You can share your opinion, but at least read up before sharing something, before discussing about tiger behavior, read up. Don't make your own stories about this is what the guide said and this is what the driver told me. That doesn't become fact. So that risk is there.
I think that's why That's why these positions of fact checkers and misinformation and disinformation correspondents, like I'm doing for Sentient now, you see more and more of these outlets creating these positions as these, people who are keeping track of the myths and keeping track of the misinformation and disinformation, which we know is purposefully put out into the world to disinform people. I think that it's going to become a more important position than ever, especially now with the infiltration of AI information and imagery into media spaces. Debunkers like myself are going to be very busy.
Everyone's talking about AI at the moment and what the next 10 years or 20 years are going to look like. And I think there's going to be a kind of step back towards media that people used to rely on, a kind of, I think, privileging of more analog forms of, and maybe this is utopian, and I think there's probably going to be a split, but I think that people are going to be more in desire of hearing from perhaps experts or people with authenticity. Or do you think it's just going to be, this is going to make it, it's going to make it so much more difficult to really know what's going on, right? The digital space, the digital news space has already made things really difficult with just the numerous amounts of voices and numerous amounts of opinions. Yeah, I never know where to take this conversation.
Yeah, I think that the digital space has done both. It has given you the freedom to be an independent voice, but it has also this other side where you have internet, you have a phone, and you can say whatever you want to. So that accountability is there in very few of these voices, and is lacking in a lot. Like there is a viral clip these days about an Indian tourist who got mauled in one of those tiger petting things in walks in Thailand, and we have wildlife influencers in our country talking about like kind of sensationalizing the whole thing because it's a hot topic. So they have picked it up and they're talking about it. But the misinformation being kind of sensationalized is the fact that this person is saying in his opinion piece that these tigers are snatched from their mothers when they're young. That's not true. These are captive bred tigers. They are not taken from the wild. So you are sensationalizing something where you are a wildlife influencer. You know it is wrong, but you will get more clicks and more views if you sensationalize it like this. So who is now accountable for these kind of things happening? That is also a bit scary.
Yeah, I mean, this is a much broader discussion that's been going on among media watchers and scholars for a long time. But I think, look, broadly speaking, I don't think you can generalize about the future of media. I think some people will be pulled back to legacy media and fact checking, which I personally think they should be, right? Like for all, like warts and all, legacy media relies on an editorial process and a fact checking process, which is how you ensure, to the extent possible, the veracity of reporting, which simply doesn't exist in podcast land and Substack land and social media, right? And this is why, so I think media literacy is important, but I also think, to the extent possible, regulation is important, but also people supporting legacy media, right? And so I don't have a solution. I don't know if anyone has a solution, but I think it's absolute. But I think disinformation, sensationalization, absolutely social media is a problem. But so is this sort of like new, whatever you want to call it, this sort of like opinion world of podcast and Substackers and whatever else, which as far as I'm concerned is just people running away from peer review. Or sorry, excuse me, not peer review, but fact check. Or both, right? Or both. Both, right? Like, right? And so all these people who are just like, oh, I just want to be like an unshackled free thinker. It's like, no, you don't. You just want to spread bullshit, unshackled from peer review and fact check, right? And so I think but it's really a question of what there's a market for and how these things are regulated. And I think there is no solution, but I think that absolutely the spread of, I know we're on a podcast, but the spread of sort of podcast culture and the spread of Substack culture and the spread of influencers in social media has been absolutely, absolutely devastating in terms of spreading misinformation and half-truths and disguising opinions as if they were fact or providing selective or poor readings of everything from, current events to scholarship. And I think this is unfortunate, because I think there are a lot of good podcasts, for instance, that will have experts on to discuss issues. But for every one of those, there's just, like a sensational stubstacker who's just making up nonsense, right? And so I think we're in a very fractured space. And I think, people like Jessica, but I think a lot more of this is needed, is people who push for media literacy and sort of finding ways to educate average, because we're talking about average consumers of news, to distinguish between opinion and sensationalism and real fact-checked news or real peer-reviewed scholarship. And I think this is a huge challenge of our time. It goes far beyond animal issues.
And I mean, I think there should be a space for people to have conversations and views, but there is a way in which we could consume and produce better with more accountability and more responsibility. And I think, again, the problem and the challenge of echo chambers of algorithms that are feeding you the same stuff again and again, and trying to even break out of that. And this, for me, I read a newspaper the other day in airport space, and I was like, wow, I'm consuming stuff that I would never be normally. There's something about picking up a magazine or a newspaper where you're going to be exposed to stories that you might not normally have come up on your Facebook feed or your Instagram. Like, you're just going to find yourself reading about the history of penguins in Peru, and that's not going to make it on your, you get an eclectic mix of information, some of which you agree with, some of which you don't agree with. And I think there's something to be said for, and I'm speaking here like a geographer, but the space of the page, right? Having a newspaper where you're being exposed to a variety of titles, a variety of opinions and views. And yeah, I think that there's something to be said for that. And yeah, I love having a podcast and having a conversation with experts, but we are not news reporters, and this is part of kind of creating these distinctions of what is my role as a podcaster and what is the role of a journalist, and there is some blurring, but yeah, it's tough,
I mean, I sort of wonder about the directionality of the news consumption, right? Because in a sense, you'd want. I mean, this is sort of like, this is a truism now, but, back in the day, everyone would sort of watch the nightly news, and you get Walter Cronkite, and he sort of tells you what the news of the day is. And then off a shared set of facts, which you can, presume are more or less factual issues, you can have debates and you can form opinions, right? Whereas now that step can be obviated. Mm-hmm. You can just get opinion, right? Or you can get primed for engagement with fact-checked news or with peer-reviewed science through opinions. You can get primed by these sort of opinion formation, right? Which is that, whatever the UC Davis Clear Center, whatever bullshit they're manufacturing, right? Biogenic methane. And so then by the time you get to a report on methane's contribution to anthropogenic climate change, you're primed to not believe it because you've digested the sort of like biogenic methane or GWP star nonsense or whatever else, right? Or if you get primed by someone who's saying, all ultra-processed foods are bad, by the time you get to sort of like a nuanced treatment of like the problems, the NOVA classification, the fact that soy-based ultra-processed burgers are actually more heart-healthy than a beef burger, you're primed to not believe the facts. And I think that directionality of consumption, that priming in sort of opinion land or non-fact check land for engagement with facts is a real problem, especially when opinion land is like a curated algorithm or is just sort of, confirming people's priors, even if those priors are not factual, right?
Yeah. So it seems like news is in crisis. I mean, not only with reporting about animals and environmental stuff. I mean, when we spoke about animals and the climate crisis earlier, we said that a lot of the reporting, there is a lot more public interest in this kind of reporting, right? And we acknowledge that that's happening. But now this conversation, assuming that even though there is this public interest, kind of getting to the facts is increasingly more difficult. There's a lot more noise. There's a lot more challenge in trying to understand fact from fiction or misinformation and active disinformation, right? So the question then becomes, and forgive me, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, so what do we do from here? If people want to be more better consumers of news, and better producers of information regarding animals and regarding the industries in which they're implicated, what are some of the tactics and things that they should be doing? Jan's eyes just look like saucers. Whoa.
Well, no, because look, I mean, I think going to your previous question, I think there are different publics, right? Like there are different publics who are differently informed. And so I think the problem is perhaps even less about getting to facts, about getting to shared facts, right? And I'm just rehearsing things people have been saying about, electoral politics, but just agreeing on a shared set of facts based on which we can have political debates of any kind. And I think that that's an issue. But yeah, I mean, look, my basic soapbox is get off social media, delete Facebook, delete Instagram, delete Twitter, and subscribe to legacy media. Real journalism costs money, right? Subscribe to the New Republic, subscribe to Vox, give some money to Sentient, right? Pay for real journalism. Real journalism is a product, and then get your news from that. Whether or not this suggestion falls on deaf ears or not is a different story, but that's what I'd say. If you want to engage with facts and get news, go to news sites, pay for news sites. Don't go to Substack. And that's really it.
Because oftentimes people are also paying for Substack. And it's not to now say, don't support people that are our opinion, but I think we somehow maybe think of media houses as having large amounts of money and being flush with cash. But
yes, and they're not. They're not, right? Like in print media in North America, I mean, maybe the New York Times is flush with cash, right? But I don't think a lot of other outlets are, and they require support. Especially as advertising dollars are spread throughout a much broader media sphere, people need to, vote with their dollars and support media, right? And it's not a tremendous amount. Like you can subscribe to all the Vox Pro content, for instance, for $40 for a year, right? Like it's not an onerous amount of money, but it does cost money. And I think this is also part of the problem, right? That social media gives you stuff, it might not be facts, it might be nonsense, but it's free, right? And the sort of constant thing where if you post something on, let's say you post something on social media and people will say, oh, it's got a paywall, I'm not going to read it. Well, it's like, well, of course you should. Like, of course it has a paywall. How do you think people pay journalists? Like the way around the paywall is a subscription, right?
And what you see on social media is not free, right? It's like, I think that's also a bit of an illusion. While you're not
sure, yeah, of course, yeah, right.
It's not free. You're being paid. It's being paid for with the advertising and with also some form of manipulation. It's not free. And I hadn't thought of it before. I'd always thought about advertisers kind of feeding into legacy media, but our subscription could also, to some extent, maybe undermine the weightiness of advertisers, because when they are so dominant in the income of media, it does, I mean, I don't want to say compromise, because they've got, regulations to deal with this type of stuff, but that our subscriptions really do matter, that journalists do good work. They're one of the most difficult and deadly professions in the world, and are perhaps not rewarded with stable jobs and incomes, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, the media is objectively in crisis, right? Look at the number of outlets that have closed in the United States or downsized in recent years, right? I mean, the fourth estate is crucial and it requires money, right? No, I mean, that's really it. Like, it's one of these things, like it's simple when you say it. Getting there is difficult, but like, yeah, just if people want good news, they should pay for news. And also, and of course there's like a role for state-funded media. So, in Canada, Mark Carney has said that he'll make CBC funding statutory, which is a really good sign. But in the United States, public media is under attack. And so, yeah, and so to the extent we want private, independent, fact-checked, reliable media, that's going to cost money, and we should just be honest about that. And people should be honest about that with themselves. If you want good journalism, you need to pay for good journalism. I've now said the same thing like 5 times, but I think it is that simple, and it's just a matter of like.
No, it's really so
clicking
important.
by.
And I'm happy you also drew in the distinction there with public versus private media, because I think public, here Austria has a very, you have to pay for your TV license, right? And a lot of people are frustrated for paying for their TV license, but that money is going directly into ensuring that public media and the extent to which people watch public media is also there's a lot more in the way of kind of clicking onto Netflix and watching a streaming service, but there is something to be said. If everything were to go belly up, your public media would be the ones that are communicating vital, important, emergency information to you, that are getting news to you and stories that matter, PSAs, public service announcements. And not to say that this can't be abused, and there aren't examples of governments abusing this, but it remains important. All right. So, sorry, we've been talking I can't believe we've been speaking for an hour already. Let's turn to your guys' quotes, unless anyone has something else they want to add here before we move on. But the quotes are a nice way to kind of perhaps pull out some last-minute conversations and thoughts, and then we'll start wrapping things up. Anyone want to start? Kick us off?
So mine is a bit unconventional. It's actually a blurb for a book. A friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Jason Hanan at the University of Winnipeg, he edited a book in 2020 called Meat-Splaining, the Animal Agriculture Industry and the Rhetoric of Denial. It's contributed by a bunch of activists talking about different ways in which the meat industry sort of denies their contribution to animal suffering and climate change. So in her blurb for the book, my other friend and colleague, Camille Labchuk, she is the executive director of Animal Justice. She's a lawyer here in Canada, animal rights lawyer. She writes, "Cruelty thrives in secrecy, and the meat industry is highly skilled at concealing the routine abuse and misery that flourishes on modern farms. Meat-splaining cuts through the spin and exposes the meat industry's massive PR machine," which I think really is the responsibility of journalists in general, to hold industry and governments and companies accountable, to cut through the spin and expose the manipulative and inaccurate and harmful PR that supports the oppression of animals and so many other vulnerable communities and beings.
I think what that also raises or makes me think about is how big industry, it's not only that we're not hearing animal stories, it's that big industry is also funding specific stories. Like you said, the spin, there's studies that industry is behind stories, and this adds to that noise we were talking about, right? It's not just a bunch of lonely podcasters creating the noise, it's also industry-backed large amounts of money that are adding to this noise, right? And that's there's kind of lobbying going on to get your minds and thoughts
and to change the narrative, right? And so that's again where this misinformation and disinformation comes into play. Is that a lot of it is it's not an accident. A lot of it is industry backed and is very well funded. And we know that with the ultra processed meat narrative that came about very much from PR companies from meat industry backed groups. And so we have to make sure that as journalists we hold truth to power and hold these types of industries and their spin accountable, and having the tools to work through, industry jargon and language that's used to often paint animal issues or food issues a certain way. That comes with media literacy on part of the reader, but also is important for journalists to not be swayed by industry groups, lobby groups, and their narratives about these topics.
What role does state regulation play here? Like I see an advert of McDonald's saying they're green burger that's environmentally and climate friendly. And I'm like, wait, hang on. How does this, and there's a role of journalists here to call out that bullshit. But there's also what role does there's a lot of stuff happening here in Europe at the moment about what is a sausage and what can we call milk and what can't we call milk. And I'm just curious to know your thoughts on what role.
That's another industry tool, right? Going after terminology, nomenclature, labeling has been a tool used by the meat industry, the animal agriculture industry, to thwart the efforts and success of plant-based products. And so it is up to governments and regulatory agencies to look into why these things are being questioned to begin with. Like, I think we talk so much in the media, like people, Yana and myself, who will look at things like labeling issues and go down that rabbit hole. But if it weren't for us, who else is going to do it? That's my question, is often like, where are the government regulators who are looking into this farm that claims that it has free range chickens? Like, if we're not looking into it, or if activists, even grassroots activists, aren't looking into it, it just wouldn't be looked into. And I think that's a big problem.
That's true. And there's such a gap between, what's on paper as policy and what's implemented on ground. So again, like Jessica was saying, like, if we don't get these evidences out, then nobody will know. And like, we have, like in India, there are situations where, like, a corporation which is backed by a mining company is actually funding a study on biodiversity in a grassland. Like, how does it make sense? That eventually that mining company will take over that land and dig it, because on paper grasslands are like wastelands. So, it's not that tough to take over that land, but that piece of habitat supports so much of wildlife, and it could be the only green space in that little, area, which is then surrounded by urbanization. But that study is being backed by a mining company. So, we don't see the narrative that we are being pushed into. There's so many different glasses that are put in front of our eyes. Always seeing visuals of, oh, look, the wildlife is so beautiful. Oh, such beautiful green forests and rivers and oceans. But reality is rapidly changing, and we are not seeing enough of those visuals. So we are not even connecting with what's happening on ground. With these concepts.
Yeah, and the connections you're talking about. You mentioned earlier, kind of just making those connections explicit, like all of you have been saying, say what's happening, make those connections visible. And that then makes it easier, I suppose, for policymakers, for other practitioners to also have these conversations and perhaps to implement some form of change.
Yeah, and how will you, as a citizen, how do you even hold power to accountability? Because you are told that, okay, this is the law, this is the policy. So as a citizen, you would believe that it is being implemented. You are not going to go to the farms and to the fisheries to see what's happening on ground. You will believe that the food I'm buying is sourced well, it is nutritious, there is no pesticides used in the agriculture and all of that, because it says organic. But it is, unless you show the citizen the evidence, they will believe that narrative which has been told to them, that organic means healthy and fine and all good and all well, and you eat it.
What about consumers of media kind of feeling inundated by just all the critique and all the criticism? I mean, I suppose this is not your responsibility as journalists, as people with the news. It's not your role to protect the consumers of news, but that there is perhaps a kind of shutdown where if we're just so critical of if the government is screwing up, if industry is screwing up, if everything is just going to shit, I guess consumers of media also start switching off. Maybe this just speaks to that same problem earlier, and maybe that's not the role of journalists to be concerned with that. But is it something that concerns you? Something you've thought about in your work? Any of you?
Well, I think that's why the rise of solutions journalism that's becoming much more popular now is solutions-based journalism, and I think that's part of the reason is because of reader fatigue and things like climate anxiety and information glut. I think is leading to people turning away from bad news. And so solutions-based journalism is sort of a newer idea where everything comes with a solution, albeit with caveats, of course, to be nuanced and accurate. But solutions-based journalism is allowing people to, I think, feel a little bit more positive about what they're reading.
And also hopeful, because everything is going down the drain, you globally, like there are wars and this and that, and then you have climate change, and so it's all like, it's like, it just pushes you into this corner of feeling that everything is gloom and doom. So then if you add on even more stories about suffering and all that, it might just push the audience, and that I would even open this article because the headline itself is creating anxiety for me. But if it's like Jessica was saying, if it is about the solution, if it is about hope, while talking about the current situation, so you're informing the audience regarding what the issue is and why it needs to be addressed, but you're also leaving the audience with a thought, with a question of better, solutions and hope and expectations.
Yeah, I always just have the concern that sometimes people read things and then if they think that it's hopeful, that they feel like their job is done and they don't have to. But maybe I'm just a cynic and a critic at heart. it's a difficult line to walk. Shatabdi, why don't you read us your quote next?
Yeah, so I had saved, I'll just read. Yeah, so I had saved John Berger's quote from the Why Look at Animals. Most animals disappear from the media in one of two ways. They are either sentimentalized or made invisible. So this kind of, I always keep thinking about this when I'm in spaces where I have to document what's happening, because it doesn't need to be either or. It is what it is, at the end of the day. And talking about, the beauty of nature doesn't erase the fact that we are in a crisis that we have created. So.
And I think there's something to be said about taking that beauty seriously. Somehow we've equated beauty with sentimentality, like to acknowledge, but also there's something for taking animals and their space and nature and the ways in which there is something to be said for being serious about these matters and taking their experiences and the ways in which they are interconnecting with a whole host of different crises or events like a barn fire, etc. It's or the questions you raised earlier about conservation and lack of land. I think there is something, I think it's respecting the beauty and the potential of that beauty to take it seriously. I think to do anything other than take it seriously is perhaps, to sentimentalize it is perhaps to do it a disservice. Yeah.
I mean, it's all great to romanticize it and be all like, oh, Mother Nature and all, but that shouldn't move you away from the ground reality.
All right, Jan, then we're with you.
Well, so this isn't, I'm not one for aphorisms, so this isn't a full quote, but I think it's a concept that not enough people talk about. And it's from the anthropologist Noé Lévy, who's a French anthropologist who wrote the book Animal to Edible, and is importantly sort of a very senior voice in the animal space, but not a vegan or an animal person. But anyway, she writes that meat is a quote unquote political commodity, in that it involves a social rather than an individual decision about who can be killed. And so meat in this way involves the entire polis, or the entire political community. And I think that this gets at the heart of, at least in the food space, the animal question, right? Like, we're so used to talking about this thing in terms of individual proclivities, individual taste, individual ethical positions. But look, ultimately, factory farming exists because it's legal, and it's legal because people acquiesce to it as citizens and as consumers, which on the one hand leads us to the grim conclusion that most people are complicit in the single most violent industry in human history, directly, personally. But also that it can be otherwise, that different political realities are possible, right? But it's also, I think, very clear about the fact that these are ultimately, political issues, not just individual ethical issues, but societal issues that affect us all, right? Like the factory farm is a political decision. The mink farm is a political decision, right? The legality of trophy hunting is a political decision. And I think that that's important to keep in mind.
And not only political in the, I guess, like legal sense in terms of the laws, but also, like you said, the polis, the idea of what our society is or is not, right? It's the idea of how we function, who is considered, I guess, a subject in the law, as well as a subject in our environments, and whose interests are taken into account or not into account. I mean, that's all political. Whose interests are reported on or not reported on is also political, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And also, what kind of a world do we want? Do we want to build and live in and work towards? And who matters, right? Who matters or not in that world?
I can't think of a better place to leave this conversation than saying who matters in this world, because I think that cuts to the heart, I think, of what a lot of media is often asking, and if not asking, should be asking. So before we leave, thank you, all three of you, for your time today. If you want to give a quick goodbye and let us know what you're currently working on, and if people are interested in learning more about your work, where they can find you.
I'm currently working over at Sentient, like I said, debunking all of the pervasive myths around the food system and the use of animals, and as well as climate change. So follow me over there. And if you have any interest in Canadian media, I write for the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star and the Winnipeg Free Press, and anyone else who will let me up here in Canada.
Jan, how about you? What you're currently working on?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's just Dutkiewicz.com. I'm not going to spell it out, but I'm sure you can find it in the show notes. I just finished a book co-written with Gabriel Rosenberg. It's called Feed the People. It'll be out from Basic Books early 2026. And I'm finishing up an academic monograph about the politics of violence in the American meat industry, and that's called An Industry Like Any Other.
Amazing. I look forward to reading both of those. Shatabdi, how about you?
Just finishing an edit on a story regarding indigenous knowledge and climate change, like their understanding of it. So it's a story for an NGO that were working with the indigenous communities down south. And along with that, just doing prep for a story around, again, like farmed animals and heat stress and all that. That's what's happening currently. And I don't have a website till yet, but I'm on Instagram. That's where I just put out some of my work. So yeah, you can find me on Instagram.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to put links to everything in the show notes. Thank you so much, all three of you, for joining me today. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Shatabdi, Jessica, and Ian for being incredible guests and giving so freely and willingly of their thoughts and ideas and time. Thank you also to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, and Law and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E, for sponsoring this podcast, and to the Pollination Project, the School of Modern Language, the Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts, as well as the School of Literature, Media and Communication at Georgia Tech University for sponsoring this season. The bed music was composed by Gordon Clark and the logo designed by Jeremy John. This episode was produced, hosted, and edited by myself. This is The Animal Turn, with me, Claudia Hertenfelder.
For more great iROAR podcasts, visit iROARpod.com. That's iROARpod.com.